Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to The Source for our February lecture in Series 13 of the Tipperary People and Places series. Tonight we welcome Dr. Brian Casey. Brian is a native of Ballinasloe, and I got to know Brian maybe 3-4 years ago when he came here to Tipperary Studies to do some research. So you all know me, I never pass a speaker by, and I had Brian caught by the ankle before he left Tipperary Studies. So Brian comes to us tonight to talk about the Tipperary by-election of 1869 and the election of O'Donovan Rossa. So maybe I should apologise to you that we have an election talk this week. Maybe you're a little bit fed up of it, but at least it is a totally different aspect of election. So welcome, Brian, and welcome to everybody here tonight.
Thank you, Mary. So I want to thank Mary for the invitation, and I was just telling her this evening, for some reason I went on Twitter today just to get annoyed, but someone tweeted about, do people use public libraries today? And you can see the overwhelmingly positive response on Twitter, people telling them that they're used. And even when I remember coming here first to Tipperary Studies and remarking to myself what a wonderful place it is. And this entire space here as well is a very nice place to be as well. And I'm just nice to be amongst Tipperary hospitality as well today, even though I'm from Galway. You know, we'll say that. So I'm just giving this is a very quick, this is your life of O'Donovan Rossa. So he was born in 1831 in Skibbereen, and he became a shopkeeper, in Rosscarbery, but he became a shopkeeper in Skibbereen and was imprisoned for a number of years then because of his Fenian activities. His ideas kind of set the scene for the Fenians as well. So he ended up being exiled in the United States for the rest of his life. He organised the Dynamite campaign, which was a bombing campaign going on particularly in England during the 1880s. And what struck me about him in particular was the fact he had 18 children, and he was married 3 times. And I know of one of the children, they tried to get him into St. Jarlath's in Tuam at one point, I think around the 1880s during the Land War. Archbishop McHale of Tuam was known as the Lion of the West, was quite a radical Fenian-esque kind of bishop. And Canon Burke of Tuam was the president of St. Jarlath's, and St. Jarlath's was seen to be a Fenian hotbed, so trying to keep it going. So he died in June 1915 and buried in August 1915. And I think a lot of us will remember, I suppose, a few years back about when the Decade of Commemorations, this is one of the more fraught ones at the time. People feared that would be a very fraught one. And I think if anyone's ever gone to Glasnevin Cemetery at a certain time of the day, they do the graveside oration that Pearse gave, which is what they see had started what became the 1916 Rising. But the fools, they have left us our Fenian dead. And while Ireland holds these graves, Ireland unfree shall never be at peace. This is how many people know of Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa. Patrick Pearse's oration over his grave in 1915 gave the new generation of Republicans a new impetus to pay homage to the Fenians of 1867 and carry on their legacy through armed insurrection. His death in Staten Island, aged 83, and subsequent funeral in Dublin gifted this new revolutionary generation a useful and evocative propaganda tool. The more disparaging will remember the Fenians that their interests did not include social and political reform, but rather they focused upon armed insurrection, cricket, dynamite, marching and drinking. Connacht Fenians became politically engaged following the failure of the 1867 rebellion. The revolution of rising expectations that saw improved quality of life following the trauma of the famine did not trickle down to all classes. Orthodox Fenians were suspicious of a social programme, but this social deprivation was too profound to ignore, and it proved useful in organising the politically engaged lower classes. While O'Donovan Rossa was the first Fenian to be elected to Parliament, it was this man, John O'Connor Power, was the first Fenian to take a seat in Parliament. He was a former member of the Supreme Council. He was described by his enemies as the bastard son of a policeman called Fleming, born in the Ballinasloe workhouse. Tim Healy said he reeked of the common clay. People don't know about him, but he was a threat to Parnell at one point in the 1870s. He was one of the architects behind the obstruction campaign that tried to shut down Parliament to bring the attention of Ireland to greater attention. He was elected MP for Mayo in 1874. Later in the 1870s and 1880s, we see other Fenians being elected and taking their seats in Parliament as part of a new departure in Irish politics, where parliamentary and physical force nationalists tried to find some common ground. The Fenians benefited from the political ambiguity and fluidity of the 1850s and 1860s. Politics was in the process of realigning itself, with individuals and groups attempting to assert themselves during a time where impact and success could not be obtained merely by the iteration of standard catch cries. This is the time that saw Tenant Right emerge as well as an issue for people. But this clarion call would only benefit a small section of the population. Agricultural labourers were excluded from such reforms as tensions between farmers and labourers still lingered. Labourers remained a significant element of the rural population, and this meant that no national movement could succeed without embracing their cause. And this was a lack of constant employment. Despite not being able to vote, they were politically engaged and remained independent of other factions. So we see the decline of agricultural labourers after the famine. So, for example, David Fitzpatrick gathered some stats back 40 years ago about this. So in 1841, he said there were 271 labourers for every 100 farmers in Tipperary. And it was the same nationally as well. By 1871, the number of labourers to farmers was 194 to 100 in Tipperary and 160 to 100 in the country. A massive decline, as you will agree, but still a significant part of the population. Throughout the 19th century, elections gave landlords and clergy an opportunity to express political identity and opinions more overtly. These groups were invariably antagonistic to each other, but embodied themselves as certain values and aspirations of which they were the leading spokespeople. And the Fenians threatened this. There are a variety of reasons for landlords to involve themselves in electoral politics, with the most obvious being the maintenance of traditional patterns of control and hierarchies. They have strong views about what was and what was not correct in the organisation of county politics. And these tell us a lot about the mental makeup of local society. For landlords, false local connections sparked real anger. So if you were coming from outside the county to run for election, it was the landlords very often that got angry with that. And we see this kind of contention going on today, that if someone comes from outside the constituency to run for election, they are not really treated with, I suppose, a degree of respect. And you see, particularly in Dublin, you see people looking to run for the Dáil will move to a constituency as well. Larger landlords use their local influence to increase their informal prestige and formal precedence in local communities. They use it to reinforce their status, and also trying to ensure that they had as many electors on their estates as possible. Between 1852 and 1868, only 38% of all Irish elections were contested. People were generally returned unopposed. In 1859, the Tories won a clear majority of the 105 Irish seats in Westminster. Because of this, it would be difficult to launch a national anti-landlord campaign. And it is this reality, what Theo Hoppen has said, which gave the practical politics of this period an essentially non-ideological flavour. And it's important, therefore, to examine them in terms of the mechanics and manipulation of what each campaign did, rather than in terms of each campaign's ideology. But the clergy were very important in this period as well. They were rising as a political bloc during the 19th century. However, landlords and many others failed to appreciate that they did not have a unified view of politics. For many landlords, the priest, in a quote, was in truth the dark figure at the gate, the articulator of the even less perfectly recognised aspirations and discontents of a peasantry, viewed always as a mass, unquote. At a meeting reported in the Westmeath Guardian, for example, in August 1965, the Marquess of Westmeath thundered about clerical involvement in politics and the problems that he believed this presented. And he said, "I am sure no member of my family would ever propose at a public meeting 3 cheers for the priest. Animals who, although nurtured upon the public stirabout and buttermilk of Maynooth, have assumed to themselves, by means peculiarly their own, to be the patron of the county representation. The Catholic clergy threatened landlords' political and economic roles in society. Both sides had electoral armies that organised and whipped up voters into excitement. There were landlords that were concerned with debates as to the morally proper limits to which electoral power could be taken. An important thing to remember about elections, they provided some of the circuses and the entertainment of life at the time. Okay? People went to speeches and to campaigns, partially for entertainment as well, to see what was going on, because there was a whole spread beyond that as well. People would go to a meeting and go to the pub afterwards and have a discussion about this as well. So it's part and parcel of the entertainment of rural and urban life. Sources are important, obviously, for our understanding of elections and electioneering. And they vary according to how contentious the election was. And they become more rich as the 19th century progresses. So by the mid-1870s, you see really, really rich recordings of speeches in the newspapers. And another important source were election petitions. So if an election result was challenged, which happened quite often, you see a lot about how an election campaign worked. But I'm going to focus mostly on newspapers this evening, okay, looking at the Nation and how they recorded Rossa's nomination and election. But I suppose in relation to this evening in Tipperary, one that really interested me when I was reading around this was that one from 1877, a landlord trying to please everyone. He wanted to remain neutral. He told one half of his tenants to vote for one candidate and the other half to vote for the other, hoping to keep everyone happy. But also these petitions show how tenants could gain benefits. They used it to extort concessions from their landlords. A Catholic country gentleman, Thomas Wise, said in 1828 that landlords had a sense of entitlement to take possession of the conscience and vote of what he described as their half-educated tenantry. It's important to remember also that there was genuine loyalty towards landlords amongst tenants, and elections were often contests between coalitions of local gentry for power and prestige. During the 1860s, Fenianism was starting to offer a new alternative beyond the local expressions of politics that had existed previously. While they were initially dismissive of pursuing an agricultural agrarian policy that would attract more support, they did play an important role in politicising the countryside during the 1860s and 1870s. They were forced to reappraise their approach following the defeat of the rebellion of 1867. The Amnesty movement is now taking shape in Ireland, which is calling for the release of Fenian prisoners. It had enormous support in most parts of the country. Officials soon realised that it was an important but worrying development in post-Famine politics because it encompassed all non-conservative political viewpoints. There have been 48 Amnesty Association meetings between July and October 1869, and a total attendance was said to be in the region of 638,000. 595,000 attended 27 meetings in Munster. 8 of these were in Tipperary, and they helped to create a very excited atmosphere in the county prior to Rossa's election. While initially determined to keep his head down in Pentonville and Portland prisons, conditions and restrictions imposed upon Rossa soon made him determined to be as difficult and obstinate as possible to his jailers. At Millbank, for example, he was frustrated with his treatment in the yard, and he threw a tool at a prison officer. And there were various other slights upon his dignity throughout his time in prison, and when the governor came to visit him in one prison, he greeted him with the contents of his chamber pot. And this resulted in him being handcuffed behind his back for a month. And the thing about his handcuffing, which I found quite striking, was that they wouldn't let him wear his braces, so his hands behind his back with the trousers around his ankles. And he tried to gnaw holes into his trousers to hook them with his shirt. He got punished for that because he destroyed his clothes. And he tried to, when he was reading, he had to use his tongue or his nose to turn the page. And as a very, very bad experiment, I tried to do that today in the office, just put my hands behind my back and try to turn the page. And it's very, I know I need to go do Pilates or something, but it's very, very hard to do this. And to try and read a book and to have this way for 33 days was, again, it was a cruel and unusual punishment even for the time. They allowed him to have his hands forward for eating, but they kept his hands handcuffed. And they kept handcuffing him. Okay, so it was a way to try and break him and degrade him and humiliate him. But this is how this is how he became a well-known prisoner. This is how people knew who he was because of this treatment of him. So John Gray, who was an MP and also owner of the Freeman's Journal, he raised Rossa's treatment in the House of Commons in June 1869 with the Home Secretary Henry Bruce. And Gray said the prison officers had manacled Rossa's hands behind his back so that he could neither dress nor undress nor raise food to his mouth, and continued this cruelty for 33 days. And Bruce, this is a picture of Bruce I found, he said he'd only manacled for a day, which is clearly not the case. And he was subsequently released from them when he had dinner. He said also that Rossa had smashed the furniture in his room after this and was placed in a darkened cell then where he could do no damage. These reports of Rossa's treatment helped to give him a high profile by the time of the by-election. And even those that are offended by Fenianism were horrified at the idea of him being shackled for a month because it challenged any notion of British civility. And it highlighted, in their views, the British government's hostility to Ireland. So by running Rossa for election, it was going to be a clear gift, a great gift for Irish nationalism, while also acting as an affront to the Catholic middle-class sense of respectability, threatening their belief that they were the suitable standard bearers to succeed the aristocracy in spheres of influence. This by-election came about following the death of Charles Moore, who had been sympathetic towards Fenian prisoners. And nominations opened in Clonmel in November, on Monday, 22nd November. The nation reported a generally peaceful atmosphere before the doors opened, but subsequently commented that there was a noisy crowd that were raucous throughout the entire nomination process. In its observation of proceedings, the English newspaper, Saunders Newsletter, said the greater part of it was occupied by respectable persons of the town, while the galleries are crowded with a mob taken from the lower orders of the town, and there's an almost total absence of country people. In general, the formal nomination of candidates took place at a public meeting in the county town. This is the general thing for elections at this time. If there are more candidates than seats, a vote was taken there and then by a show of hands. Only if a loser in this vote refused to accept the verdict was a poll arranged, which was an open vote. So this is 3 years before the Secret Ballot Act, so everyone had to declare their voting intention in public. So Denis Caulfield Heron was from Newry, and he was a lawyer, and he was nominated by the Tipperary Town branch of the Tenant League. And he was unanimously endorsed by the County Liberal Club with the support of the Archbishop of Cashel and the clergy. And while he was a supporter of amnesty, this did not endear him to the Fenians. Many amnesty campaigners did not necessarily want to secure the release of prisoners, but rather to embarrass Gladstone. Father Richard Cahill of Knockavilla proposed Heron, and as he did, the nation reported the mob on the gallery immediately commenced shouting and yelling and created the most deafening noise. There were repeated cries of, "We'll have no more lawyers, nobody but Rossa for Tipperary." Another voice shouted, "The people will not vote for Heron." James F.X. O'Brien was one of the youngest members of the Fenians, and he came up at this time, he was one of the younger members, he came up with the idea of running a convict that had not been pardoned. And Rossa was selected because he was the most demonstrative, the best known to the public, and the one who appeared to have suffered the most. Patrick Mackey of Templemore and Michael Carroll of Borrisalee proposed and seconded Rossa's nomination, with Mackey saying that he saw him as a fit and proper person to represent Tipperary in Parliament. And you see a lot of speeches in this recorded in the nation as well, and they indicated a desire to have a contest in Tipperary. And the nation reports that Heron was met with groans and hisses from the crowd in the gallery, sympathetic to Rossa, but then met with cheers from those in the main body of the court. Nevertheless, he was constantly drowned out whenever he tried to speak, and an appeal for quiet was subsequently made, And you see this being noted in the newspapers that they could not record what was being said because of the noises. The journalists, the reporters could not hear what was being said. But the speeches in favour of Heron didn't really capture what people thought at the time. For example, Father Cahill said his speech made reference to what he saw as disastrous attempts at revolution that saw a large number of people in prison. He thought these prisoners should be released, but he also said that Heron should be returned to Parliament. In response to the various cries calling for the election of Rossa, Cahill reminded the audience that he needed to be released from prison if he were to take his seat. This is correct, but this is a way to kind of pour petrol on the fire in many ways. Cahill believed that Heron would be a suitable representative for Tipperary because he could agitate for tenant right and fix the tenure for honest farmers. And the voice shouted, "We hear nothing about tenant farmers until the election time comes, and then we hear plenty." He believed that Heron would work for a solution to the land question. J.W. Cook, who was a JP from Ballinasloe, seconded this nomination, but he could not be heard owing to the cacophony in the courtroom. Heron said he spoke about tenant right on previous occasions when it was not fashionable and had written a pamphlet about it. During his speech, he claimed to be the popular candidate, and somebody shouted from the crowd, "You are not the popular candidate." Peter Gill was greeted with cheers that were mingled with hisses when he went to speak. And he then offered to resign on behalf of O'Donovan Rossa. He was dismissive of Heron using the election to further his legal career, because the parliamentary route was a known way for lawyers to get work in the future. And it was also seen to be a way for the sons of landlords to have a career before maybe they took over the running of the estate or the management of the estate as an agent. Gill dismissed Heron's views on land, arguing that his only response to the whole system of rack rents had broken the back of tenants. The idea of fixed tenure was not necessarily what he saw to be the issue. It was rack rents. And he asked Heron to sign a document that he would serve the people of Tipperary faithfully and would refuse any appointment from government, and that his first cry and last cry until the prison doors are open will be the liberation of political prisoners. So this is the pamphlet for O'Donovan Ross's election. Okay, I realise it's not very clear here. Okay, just the image I found online wasn't great. But what it is, it's basically it's a call for amnesty, a call for the release of political prisoners. Okay, not necessarily anything relevant to do with Tipperary as such. And it's something I noticed with a lot of these pamphlets at the time. They don't really focus on local issues like what TDs are do today. They focus on the amnesty issue. And O'Donovan Rossa was the way to highlight this cause as well nationally. An important thing to remember about Heron is that he was a sincere advocate for tenant right. He genuinely believed this is a good thing, and he was genuinely seen by many people in public opinion to be a good candidate, a potentially good MP. But the timing was wrong. The public mood was more sympathetic towards a political prisoner that could never take his seat after being elected. And it's dangerous to draw parallels, but we've seen this in more recent times as well about political prisoners being elected to Parliament. Okay, and it's a very good way of highlighting an issue as well. And to think about, another thing that worked against Heron at the time was that he was not hostile towards landlords. Okay, there was a kind of an anti-landlord movement slowly emerging at this time as well. Another big issue about election campaigns at this time was violence. And violence was present at this particular by-election campaign. And following Heron's speech, it was reported that sticks were used pretty freely upon people up in the gallery. Police tried to restore order, but not before receiving some ugly head wounds. There was commotion in Nina when Rossa was officially nominated, and he was called the People's Champion. This all caught other people by surprise, and it caused other factions, the landlords and the clergy, by surprise. The Express said the clerical party has been completely hoodwinked. They were so sure of a walkover that not a professional man had been employed, no any arrangements made to convey voters to the poll. The consequence of this overweening confidence is that the party has been completely paralysed. While they could not vote, labourers and artisans gathered at Cashel to celebrate Ross's nomination. There have been reports of attacks on the house of Father Howley, but it is believed that this mob was looking for Father O'Neill, who had played a role in the nomination of Heron. And the nation said, the humbler classes here have an idea that if Rossa is returned 3 times to the county, that the election must be held as valid by Parliament, and it will be difficult to convince them that Heron must be elected, as Rossa could not be returned. They did not care. It was clear Rossa could not be returned. They did not care. People were going to vote for him. But there had been some fear that Rossa's nomination would not be accepted. The High Sheriff, Bagwell, accepted the nomination. And people ask, was it partially because of spite? Because he had looked for the nomination against Heron at one point and lost out. Okay, but this is, and people wondered, was this why he did it? It was what happened anyway. So following his nomination, the nation reported, the crowd wanted to hear nothing but O'Donovan Rossa. They entertained no hostile feeling towards Mr. Heron. They found no fault with his political programme, but they had set their hearts on the election of a man who was suffering in a prison cell for his love of Ireland, and they would tolerate no other candidature. And there's great excitement and collective effervescence around the county when word got out about his nomination. Tara Barrows is set ablaze here in Thurles. For people who were celebrating the news, 2,000 people turned out to celebrate it. The Clonmel Chronicle reported that one man got so excited that he fell into the fire next to where he was standing. At Cashel, the excitement saw the Riot Act being read in order to disperse the crowd. When the poll closed, Rossa was deemed elected. He had received nearly 160 more votes than Heron, and the widest joy was manifested in the chief towns of the county. Many people, large crowds, were singing and cheering his election. It's important to remember that there's a very low 23% turnout at this election. While this could be seen to be a certain indifference towards politics, it was this vacuum that the Fenians succeeded in exploiting. Ross's rural strength outweighed his opponent's support among town supporters. In Tipperary town, the so-called comfortable farmers of the Clonwilliam barony gave Rossa an overwhelming majority of 497 to 10, even though the local clergy were very hostile towards him. Ross's support was amongst all non-landowning classes in the county. So upon his election, Rossa was transferred to Millbank Prison. No, he wasn't. He asked for a transfer to Millbank Prison because it's close to Westminster, be close to work from. That's what he said to the prisoners, the prison guards. He remarked to others in prison that if he were ever to take a seat in Parliament, he would make his maiden speech in Irish to force the British government to hire an Irish interpreter. He praised the people of Tipperary for electing him, and the courage to highlight the conditions that he was forced to ensure. Heron's defeat was a surprise to people. It was a real surprise. Tipperary voters wanted the reforms that he put forward, but they were also sympathetic towards Rossa. Their style of canvassing was not necessarily sophisticated, but it was very effective. For example, there was the story of those not entitled to vote stopping those on the way to vote and inviting them into the pub until after the polls are closed. So they kept them there, okay, and they're in the company of Rossa supporters in the pub until the poll are closed. And you see these kind of stories, you hear these stories quite a lot of, even today, I suppose, of people buying people pints, going to the election, or getting lifts and this kind of stuff. But also, the threat of the mob was a theme in elections this time, the threat of violence, that if you were known to be voting for someone else, a mob or a group of people would try and convince you otherwise to vote for someone else, vote for the person they want you to vote for. I mean, this was not a local campaign. It did attract national attention. Okay, there were meetings in Sligo, Limerick, Clare, Kerry, and the grazing areas of East Galway, where stalwart men gathered in enthusiastic force, supporting Rossa's victory. And Charles Kickham fought the by-election that came about, because obviously Rossa couldn't take his seat. So Kickham was asked to fight the by-election because he was also a felon. Rossa was disqualified because he was a felon. There was a great energy amongst the nationalists, amongst the Fenians, following Rossa's victory, so they thought they could do it again. But some of them wanted to have Rossa run for election, some of them wanted Kickham to run for election. That kind of split the organisation. But another consequence of Rossa's election is that it helped energise the countryside as well, so that for the 7 subsequent by-elections until the general election of 1872 saw nationalist MPs being returned. 6 of these are held prior to the Secret Ballot Act of 1872. And it's been argued that his victory may have helped to embolden the nationalist cause. I mean, it was clear throughout the entire campaign, no one really cared that Rossa couldn't take his seat. This is still a remarkable achievement. The Nation said, while the government is herding him with felons and setting him to the labour of brutes, an Irish constituency elects him to a place in the British Parliament. The newspaper saw his crime to be more of a political rather than a criminal nature. It remarked that Irish people venerated martyrs and there were nationwide celebrations for his election. He was described as the man that was both feared and detested by the British government, which meant that they were barbarous in the treatment of him. And it was because of all this helped to ensure his election as MP for Tipperary. Ordinarily, Heron was a suitable candidate, but the prevailing public opinion and prevailing public sympathy towards Rossa meant that it would have been difficult for anybody to challenge him. Despite being a felon and there being great resistance from landlords and clergy and their combined might, open voting and a limited franchise, none of this could stop him being elected and being returned for Tipperary. It does reflect the fact that Tipperary was a radical county, and this seemed not to have been appreciated by those that are going against Rossa. The election was voided in February 1870, and some supporters thought it would be counterproductive to run Rossa again, even though there was still some support in doing so. This is how Kickham came to be the candidate. There was also talk of Heron offering £600 or £700 to the Fenian Prisoner Fund if Kickham withdrew from the election. And there were those that favoured Kickham withdrawing his support. There were also those that could see there was popular support for a Fenian to seek the nomination. The Fenian opponents were better organised and better prepared for this, and they had better protection for the electors, bringing them to the polls. And there was a petition on Kickham's behalf to void the poll, because he lost by only 4 votes. Okay, but the petition was prepared poorly by the plaintiffs, which meant that it was dismissed. But the fact that he lost by only 4 votes was seen by the Fenians as a moral victory. Rossa was put up as a protest against Whiggery and to rally the Fenians. People were caught unaware by his candidacy. It was announced late, and the fact that he was a felon meant that many assumed Heron would be returned, and no arrangement had been made otherwise. His election was a lesson for the clergy, landlords, and even the Fenians themselves. The clergy and landlords were defied by those that publicly voted for a convicted felon against someone that was seen to be a suitable candidate for the Catholic voters of Tipperary. By the time of the second by-election the following February, nothing was left to chance. And again, while he was elected by 4 votes, this is helped by the divided Fenian camp. And there were still 1,600 people that showed the priests were not universally recognised as the minds of the Irish people. And while many with nationalist leanings were jumping aboard the Gladstonian juggernaut, embracing the grand old man's view of democracy and the politics of humanitarianism, Tipperary showed that there is still a space for a distinct radical nationalist party to emerge in the country if the right leadership emerged. Thank you very much.